This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 329 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. This one's about museums and ethical issues, an episode I've been looking forward to putting together for a while. Firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording this podcast, and of course they are amongst many marginalised groups who have been affected by poor museum ethics and decisions over the centuries. It's one of those many occasions where we can say, now we know better and we should do better. So I've got an example actually just before we get into my guests, and we have a fabulous museum here in Perth, Western Australia. It was originally it was originally the state, the WA Museum, and it was completely rebuilt and overhauled a few years ago and reopened just in 2020. Its name is Bulla Bardip, which are Noongar words that mean many stories. And I've always been quite impressed by how they are approaching this topic of ethics these days. It's a lot of things to deal with. And I was reading their Reconciliation Action Plan, and I thought that the part of that was a really relevant thing. So they say, key to the development of Bulla Bardip is a principle that now permeates through every part of our organisation, that we will not speak for people who will speak for themselves. And I thought that's, a good principle to start with. So, of course, it's not that simple, and we're going to talk about a variety of ethical issues today, not just about that kind of, colonialization and the things you often see in the headlines of artifacts and stuff that should be returned to where they came from, etc. We will talk about that as well, but we'll also be talking about medical museums and art galleries. So a bunch of really interesting stories today. And first up is Chris Christou from the End of Tourism podcast, and he has a lot to say about ethical issues in museums. In fact, we could have talked for hours, I think. And his focus is on the archaeological artefacts and what we should be doing. So I'll let Chris tell you what he thinks.
The public museum, has been around for about 200 years. Previous to that, there have been many private museums. But this notion of public museums in the 1800s largely arose around the same time as the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the study of archaeology. What's really fascinating for me about museums is that when archaeology began, this was also the beginning of the nation state and nationalist movements. And so when people started digging into ruins and finding these objects, right, whether they were pyramids or just a little tool or even, corpses, because of course there's a lot of grave robbing involved, for lack of a better word. So these tools, these ruins were found, like the pyramids, for example, in Mexico or Egypt or Indonesia, these vast and beautiful structures were largely covered and overgrown with soil and earth and foliage. They were, of course, uncovered and used as a way to complement the intellectual nationalist movements of saying, I'm French, or we are French. We are no longer like of this particular little community that speaks this language. No. We belong now to the nation state. And so there was a combination of archaeologists who dug up a lot of these tools in these places, anthropologists who were studying human cultures elsewhere and at home, and the museum. And so the museum would often buy these pieces from archaeologists and of course grave robbers. These weren't just people who were working for universities, but also people suddenly realizing, hey, we can make a lot of money off this. And so that's a lot of the basis, the foundation historically for how the museum was started, was robbing these earthbound, this fermenting history from the people who put them in the ground for a reason most of the time. And so this is one of the questions is like, they're not just sitting there on the ground. Of course, there's a lot of pieces that are, but why would people bury someone with a cup filled with chocolate or whatever it might have been? food so that the dead could make their way, into the other world. So we have this slowly over the course of the 19th century, this expansion, not just in Europe, but then of course in other places like the colonies, Canadian history, American history, Australian history, etc. And then with the independence movements of colonized states, we also see this nationalist fervor and movements arising, and the museums in those places being built for the nation state. And so it's really fascinating for me now that there's been a large movement towards decolonizing museums, is this repatriation of relics, of museum objects, and corpses, the corpses of the dead. What you see, surprisingly, and this doesn't come up very much in the discourse around decolonizing museums and repatriation. The idea is like, the British Museum should give all this stuff back to Libya or to Egypt or whatever. And of course, this is starting to happen in certain contexts. But part of the reason is because these countries want to use these pieces. They want to put them in their own museums. They want to use them to create or reinforce their own sense of nationalism. Right. And what's interesting, and it's very seldom spoken of, is that there are people in those places, especially if we're talking about not nation states, but indigenous communities, who say, no, we don't want those things back or we don't want those people back. I mean, in a lot of cases, they consider these objects or these corpses as their ancestors. And they say, no, after 100, 200 years of them having to be put in these kind of glass cases, incarcerated more or less, we do not want to have that energy or whatever was produced by virtue of that in our place anymore. But so it makes me wonder deeply about these notions of decolonizing museums. And so like if everyone, if all the indigenous cultures and all the, global South nation states, if everyone has a museum, then we're just good. We've set the record straight and there's this sense of equality. But what's really going on deeper down in, what's hidden in the equation that we can't see or that we're unwilling to see? And what is it about our manner of going to museums and wanting to see these things? The way in which the museum has created this kind of spectacle, and not just this spectacle, but the very sight of the spectator among us or within us that we seem to have a very difficult time questioning, let alone, undoing or subverting.
One suspects that museums would be irrelevant if we just had a better acceptance of listening to the stories and the learnings from all kinds of different communities. And it's the stories that are important, not the objects, I'm imagining. And
how much of that could even have been garnered in a time when the translations were so, and so impoverished.
Yes. The cat is definitely out of the bag, as you said. We've taken all the stuff and now we have to work out what to do with it. So much food for thought there from Chris. Whenever I speak with Chris or listen to his podcast, always makes me have a good hard think. So hopefully it's done the same for you. Now, my second guest today is Dylan Thuras from Atlas Obscura. And when I asked him about some ideas on the ethics of museums, he had a really interesting example connected to medical museums.
I'll start from a particular point or perspective, which is all the way going back to even before Atlas Obscura launched. I lived for a year in Hungary, in Budapest, and I wrote a blog with my wife called Curious Expeditions, and we traveled all over a lot of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, some Western Europe, Italy. We went to Turkey, Romania. We went a lot of places, and we were always seeking out these strange, unusual museums, locations. And we had a real penchant and took tons of photographs in medical museums, which are places that I still love. Europe is filled with a number of museums which are focused on wax anatomical models, which interestingly, actually the ethics there are like pretty chill because they're wax. They're crazy looking. They're kind of gruesome, but they're works of art.
They haven't harmed anyone. Really?
No, they haven't harmed anybody. They, in fact, they aided people back then because dissection was illegal. And so these were teaching tools for young doctors trying to learn about how the body worked. But Well, A, there's no refrigeration, right? So how do you get your hand? Corpses start to go bad pretty quickly in that environment. The church was officially against any kind of desecration. There's a lot of theological belief about sort of actually the intactness of body being important in transferring to the next plane of existence. And so these were built mostly in the 1700s, or a few in the early 1600s, but through the 1700s, even into the 1800s a bit. And then you get into some interesting like paper mache models. But they were teaching tools. Beautiful, really cool. But of course, actually, there's this transition that starts to happen as more and more doctors and surgeons start to basically say, like, look, these models are cool, but they're not enough. Like, we actually have to understand in detail how the body works. I need to be able to show students how to do this operation. I need to do live, to do dissections in front of an audience. And then you get the kind of advent of the Victorian Medical Museum, right? So you get something like the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which was originally a collection for doctors. It is now a public museum, and it is filled with skeletal preparations and, tissue preservation and all of this kind of stuff. And some of the sourcing on this stuff can be kind of questionable. And sometimes it's just got morbid or kind of grotesqueness to it, even if the sourcing is quite obvious and clear. When I started this work, very few people were paying attention to any of these museums at all. They just weren't part of people's public consciousness. Over the years, in part very rightly fueled by museums like natural history museums, which had the remains of people who did not consent to be in the museum, who have religious beliefs that make it important that their remains are buried in a specific place, or at least in the, being taken care of by a specific people. So sort of driven by this, but slowly there's been this interesting thing that has happened, which has been, I think people have become more and more uncomfortable with the showing of any human remains at all. And there's a big effort actually around the Mutter Museum to sort of de-accession or really change the way they are presenting things. I have very, very mixed feelings about this because, well, I truly understand there are definitely individual cases of specimens where it's quite obvious this needs to be repatriated, it needs to be returned, these bones should not be in your collection. However, there are other cases. I was actually just at a museum in Mexico filled with mummies.
Right.
And they're on site. They are mummies that were unearthed. It was a graveyard. And then it was a small graveyard. So they basically had to dig people up to bury new people. And when they dug people up, they found these bodies and they basically put them on display, the mummies of Guanajuato. And they've been on display for, God, a long, long time now, 50 years. But they mummified naturally, and you could make an argument that obviously these people could not consent to this display of their remains. No one knew this would happen. No one knew they would mummify. Of course, they may have known, this is a question I don't know the answer to, they may have known that they might eventually be disinterred because the nature of church graveyards is often like this. You just they stack them up until eventually there's like, we're out of room. We only got this plot of land and you got to go. So I don't know if anyone thought about that. I think people have other concerns, honestly, probably than this. But I was at this museum and it was filled with families, all local families, or at least 90% local families. There were very few sort of international tourists there, people with their kids, their grandparents, sort of looking mortality in the face, quite literally, looking at all these mummies, sometimes joking, little macabre humor, but it is very much it's in situ. It's still in the same site. The mummies, the attitude towards death is a bit more inclusive, I want to say. Like, the sort of the Western world tends to have a very like death, put it away, put it over there. It's there's something inherently wrong with death. And I don't know. I'm just not sure. Like, you could go there and you could make the argument that this is somehow doing a disservice to these people and it is disrespectful. On the other hand, I think I just see value in places where people have to kind of confront mortality and think about the bodily nature of existence and the sort of the old monk thing. The reason monks loved stacking bones everywhere and turned each other, the Capuchins, all turned themselves into mummies. So basically this memento mori, like you too shall you are not immune to this truth of all of our lives. And so I don't know. This is an area where I think there's a lot. I would be sad if we sanitized every medical museum and turned it into like plaques with text on them and touch digital screens. And like, these are visceral aesthetic experiences in a sense. And I think there's some good to that.
Yeah, I agree. While we're, trying to fix the wrongs of the past, we don't want to throw away everything and turn every museum display just into a digital touchscreen or something. I think Dylan's absolutely right there. In the show notes, I'm going to leave a link to actually an Atlas Obscura article from Dylan about this place in Mexico where the mummies of Guanajuato are held. And yeah, there's pictures. It's pretty graphic. I warn you now. My final guest today is Carol McQuaid. Carol's an artist who has been an artist in residence on a cruise ship for, I think, most of this year, and has had the good luck to see much of the world, including being down here in Australia. And so Carol's example of ethics in museums is connected to the Mona. So it's an art gallery in Hobart in Tasmania. And it's been the centre of a few ethical issues of late. And it was really interesting to hear Carol's perspective because she's been there several times recently.
When we got to Hobart, everybody said, oh my God, you've got to go to the Mona. You've got to go. It's a little controversial there to begin with because, the origins of the Mona are pretty spicy, right? David Walsh, I think that's his name.
I think you're right.
Yeah, built this crazy, impossible architecture with questionably gotten gains, and power to him. It's an architectural feat, but it houses, first of all, a lot of very controversial sexual content. So there's a lot of tittering and so on. But what was interesting for me, we were there and we'd just gone past, Google it so I don't have to say it, but the wall that everybody talks about there, it's there.
I know that wall.
Okay, yeah. So you walk past that and there's a room and it says women only or ladies only or something like that. And even as we were walking through, I was hearing comments like, isn't that sexist? And how do you exclude if that said men only, blah, blah. But we had brought another friend with us and she's like, oh, I want to see it. So we went in. Of course, it's totally luscious. It's all these green tones, the crazy serpentine green velvet sofa. And I turned and went, look at this. There's a Picasso in here that is just for us. And we're marveling at it. And there's, some other great things and so on. This was in February 24, just to give a little reference. And I think it was about June 2024 when the museum got a letter from the Picasso Foundation saying, excuse me, but that's not that painting. And it's signed Picasso. Everybody thinks it's a Picasso. And it was I found the response really interesting because, of course, it's David Walsh's wife has knocked off these famous paintings and they've put them up there under the name Picasso. They tell it now as, we did this tongue in cheek. But where is the line between like you've signed it? And so I was wondering what the outcome would be of that. And so we're back here now in Tasmania right this moment. And we were in Hobart a couple weeks ago and we went to the Mona and the painting is now out on the wall, proudly displayed. But it says basically, this is after Picasso and here is who painted it. And, we're coming out now. And
they're now telling the truth. Okay.
Yeah. And the Picasso Foundation took it gracefully and everybody's moved past it. But it was interesting. Just, I could see people being outraged. I could see people being amused. But where is the line? Especially in this very copyright riddled moment of being able to duplicate people's work so easily and not give artists credit. And, you think, well, Picasso's a big boy. His foundation can take care of themselves. But that line.
But when you're not a big boy, then that's a much more meaningful impact, isn't it?
Yeah. The line has to be held to protect artists everywhere. And it's just a good, big, bright, visible story, seeing that somebody actually made the effort to hold the line. And it was fun to see the aftermath, like to actually see the piece out of the box, out of the ladies' room that is no longer, it might be temporary, but they're not operating it as a women's only spot anymore. It really was fabulous. And it was an interesting experience. So right or wrong, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, so that passing off a Picasso definitely is a very questionable ethical tactic. So it was interesting to discuss that with Carol. Also, the other controversy at Mona, Carol alluded to it, but we didn't get a chance to chat about it fully, was a man filed a lawsuit against Mona earlier this year, 2024, saying it was discrimination that he wasn't allowed into the Ladies' Lounge exhibition. And initially the court agreed with him and said that they needed to let anyone into that area regardless of gender. So Mona turned that around by installing female-only toilets in the Ladies' Lounge so that they had a reason to not let men in. And in September, actually, then that original ruling was overturned. The judge said it's legal to discriminate if doing so promotes equal opportunity for a marginalised group. So that was interesting. But Carol was saying at her most recent visit to Mona in November, the Ladies' Lounge area was actually cordoned off with a kind of a sign saying it was being redone. So we'll have to see how that develops in the future. But yes, the Picassos are now after Picasso. Now, the other thing I wanted to add about the ethics of museums was just to follow up a little bit about something I mentioned about my UK trip in episode 326. I briefly mentioned when chatting with Tracy in that episode about my experience visiting the Manchester Art Gallery, but I thought in this episode I wanted to just dive a little bit deeper into that. It was so interesting and unexpected. I didn't know this when I went there. I just happened to be in a hotel across the road, have some free time, so I thought I'll have a wander in. So until recently, as far as I could understand, the Manchester Art Gallery had just been a pretty standard, traditional city art collection, in a beautiful building, a lot of fairly old paintings, etc. But in recent years, there'd been clearly a lot of reflection on the ethics and the values of the museum and some significant changes in the way they had displayed their collection and ongoing changes. So they describe this in their website as well as actually in a plaque at the gallery. It says, "The collection is owned by the people of Manchester. In our 200th anniversary year, we are reflecting on how the collection has been formed, how we can best use it, and how it might grow in the future." So basically, just because we have all this mostly old art done by white people doesn't mean that's what we need to do with it in the future. But it's not just about that. There's so many things. So one of their new focuses is on artists which are underrepresented. So that included women, LGBTQIA+, Black and Asian artists. Also, they were kind of reinterpreting older paintings to discuss their relevance today. So, as a really simple example, there was a painting of a red squirrel. And this red squirrel was from the 1800s. And the plaque talks about how back then, red squirrels were really common in that area. They were native to the UK. But then, in one of these many intrusions by humans, grey squirrels were introduced from another continent, and they kind of pushed out the red squirrels into remote areas, and now it's really rare to see a red squirrel. So that was just a simple example of how they're reframing the collection to kind of put them into new contexts and, modernize it, make people think. I thought it was super interesting. And in fact, they had a few different themes that they were kind of reinterpreting their collection through. So they had a section on climate emergency, migration, identities, and they're looking at happiness and connection as well. So kind of pulling together paintings from their existing collection and also acquiring new ones and making different points, making people think in different ways and, trying to, just be thoughtful about it essentially. And there was quite a few places where they also included within the individual galleries some displays that explained how they made decisions about what to include. So kind of showing the process that the museum and gallery staff undertook, which was, super interesting and very transparent as well. Oh, in one place, there's a room where there's a fairly large empty space on the wall, and the accompanying plaque says, "The empty space," in brackets, "for Black women's artworks," because they had identified that in that particular gallery, in that display, I think it was a climate justice area, I'm not sure, they had so few artworks currently by Black women that they actually couldn't find anything that they could display that they could make relevant in that topic. And so they wanted to kind of demonstrate that with their empty space. So that was just a few of the things. If you are ever in Manchester, I highly recommend that gallery. Definitely the most thoughtful art gallery I've been to in a long time. And it would be lovely to see a lot of galleries and, of course, a lot of museums being more thoughtful and diving into some of these areas. So thanks so much for listening to episode 329, and massive thanks to my guests, of course, for their really interesting input. And I've got a bunch of links in the show notes. I will share quite a few things. I'll just run through them here, but it might be a good idea to run to the show notes and click through and do some more reading if you're curious. So first of all, I chatted with Chris Christou from the End of Tourism podcast. You can find the End of Tourism podcast in all podcast apps, or go to theendofTourism.com. Similarly, another podcast host, Dylan Thuras from Atlas Obscura podcast. And of course, Atlas Obscura is also a huge website of really interesting, quirky, unusual, lesser known places that you might want to visit on your travels. So you can look up the Atlas Obscura podcast in any app. I'm also going to include a link in the show notes to Dylan's article about the mummies he refers to in Mexico. And I also, of course, chatted with Carol McQuaid. You can find out more about Carol at her website, theillustratedvagabond.com. And that includes, at the moment, she's got a gorgeous World Voyage sketchbook on sale, which includes some of the work she's been doing as she wanders the world. I'm also going to include an article from my dear friend Catherine Marshall about the Ladies' Lounge in Mona. Before it became super controversial, she was invited down there to experience some of the best attractions as in the Ladies' Lounge, and that was an interesting thing to read back on. When I was chatting with Carol, the first thing I thought of was Catherine's piece. Of course, I would also love to hear what you think, so come along and chat with us in our groups. We have the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers and the LinkedIn group for Thoughtful Travellers. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in either of those platforms and you'll find us. Don't forget, you can also stay up to date with all things thoughtful travel through my newsletter at Substack, and you can find that by going to thoughtfultravel.substack.com. So as I said, long list. If you want to see these in more detail, you can go to the show notes, which are at notaballerina.com/329. I'll also include some of my images, some of the pictures I took in the Manchester Art Gallery, so you can see some more of what I mean. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.